The sleek glass towers of the Federal Explosive Ordnance Disposal Training Center in Quantico, Virginia had never seen anything quite like Margaret Maggie Sullivan walking through their automated security gates on that humid Tuesday morning. In August, the facility represented the absolute pinnacle of modern bomb disposal technology, where America's elite EOD specialists trained with equipment that cost more than most people's houses and simulated scenarios that pushed the boundaries of human capability under extreme pressure. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At first glance, Maggie looked completely out of place among the high-tech corridors lined with holographic displays showing real-time explosive device schematics and automated training systems that could replicate any known terrorist threat with scientific precision. She appeared to be someone's retired aunt who had accidentally wandered into a classified government facility after taking a wrong turn while visiting the Smithsonian. Her weathered hands gripped a battered canvas toolkit that looked like it had survived both world wars, and her steel-gray hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail that hadn't changed style since the Reagan administration. She wore simple black cargo pants, a faded blue polo shirt with no visible insignia, and steel-toed boots that showed the kind of scuff marks that came from decades of fieldwork rather than classroom instruction. What made her presence even more jarring was the way she moved through the facility's cutting-edge environment. While other specialists strutted through the halls in tactical gear worth tens of thousands of dollars, comparing notes on the latest robotic disposal systems and discussing artificial intelligence programs that could analyze explosive devices faster than human cognition, Maggie simply followed the directional signs toward Training Bay 7 with the unhurried pace of someone who had all the time in the world. The Federal EOD Training Center represented the apex of American counterterrorism preparedness. Spread across 47 acres of Virginia countryside, the complex housed simulation chambers that could recreate any urban environment, complete with realistic building layouts, civilian populations, and explosive scenarios based on intelligence gathered from active conflict zones around the globe. The facility's primary training hall featured holographic projection systems that could display three-dimensional models of explosive devices with molecular-level detail, allowing trainees to study bomb construction techniques that had been used by terrorist organizations from Afghanistan to Somalia. Every specialist who gained access to this facility had earned their place through demonstrated excellence in high-pressure situations, where mistakes measured in millimeters could result in catastrophic loss of life. They carried certification from elite military units, federal law enforcement agencies, and specialized schools that existed at the intersection of cutting-edge technology and life or death decision-making. The morning routine at the facility followed protocols developed through decades of evolution in explosive ordnance disposal methodology. Specialists arrived before dawn to calibrate their equipment, study intelligence briefings on emerging terrorist techniques, and participate in virtual reality simulations that tested their ability to remain calm while defusing devices designed by some of the most creative and malicious minds on Earth. Dr. James Morrison, the facility's director and a former Navy SEAL with 3 decades of EOD experience, had personally overseen the development of training programs that incorporated lessons learned from every major terrorist incident of the past 20 years. His office walls displayed photographs with presidents and foreign ministers, commendations for operations that remained classified, and certificates recognizing innovations in bomb disposal technology that had saved countless lives in conflicts around the world. The specialists training under Morrison's supervision understood that their time at this facility represented access to capabilities that existed nowhere else on Earth. Selection for advanced EOD programs was limited to a handful of candidates each year, chosen not just for their technical proficiency, but for their ability to maintain perfect composure while working with devices that could vaporize city blocks. If handled incorrectly, competition at the facility was intense, professional, and conducted with the knowledge that the skills being developed would determine whether future terrorist attacks succeeded or failed. Every training exercise mattered, from the temperature sensitivity of electronic components to the psychological profiles of bomb makers, whose motivations could provide crucial insights into device construction and placement strategies. The weapon systems surrounding the facility's training areas represented hundreds of millions of dollars in research, development, and manufacturing precision. Companies like Boston Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, and specialized defense contractors had invested decades perfecting robotic systems that could approach explosive devices from safe distances, analyze their construction using advanced imaging technology, and disable them using techniques that eliminated human risk entirely. The robots alone cost more than most suburban homes and incorporated artificial intelligence capabilities that seemed like science fiction just 10 years earlier. These systems could identify explosive components through X-ray analysis, calculate blast radii with mathematical precision, and execute disarmament procedures that had been tested against thousands of simulated scenarios representing every known terrorist methodology. Senior technician David Walsh commanded respect throughout the facility based on his development of neutralization protocols that had become standard procedure for federal agencies worldwide. At 34, he possessed the kind of technical brilliance that came from advanced degrees in chemistry and engineering, combined with field experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, where he had successfully disabled improvised explosive devices that had stumped other specialists for days. Walsh's equipment represented the cutting edge of EOD technology. His primary disposal suit incorporated climate control systems, heads-up displays that could overlay device schematics directly onto his field of vision, and communication arrays that maintained constant contact with support teams who could provide real-time analysis and guidance during critical operations. The suit alone cost more than most luxury automobiles and had been tested against explosive forces that would have been considered unsurvivable just a generation earlier. His toolkit contained diagnostic instruments that could detect explosive residues at the molecular level, identify the chemical signatures of specific terrorist organizations, and predict device behavior based on construction techniques that had been cataloged through decades of intelligence gathering. Walsh approached bomb disposal with scientific methodology, maintaining detailed databases of successful techniques and failure analysis that enabled him to anticipate threats before they fully materialized. The respect Walsh had earned came through demonstrated excellence under conditions that would break most people mentally and physically. He had defused devices while under sniper fire, worked in chemical environments that required complete isolation from atmospheric contamination, and solved puzzles created by bomb makers whose primary goal was killing anyone who attempted to interfere with their work. Specialist Sarah Chun represented a different, but equally formidable presence within the facility's culture. At 29, she had overcome skepticism about women in high-risk EOD roles by consistently outperforming male counterparts in both technical proficiency and psychological resilience under extreme stress. Her academic background included advanced studies in materials science and computer programming, which she applied to developing new approaches for analyzing digital components in modern explosive devices. Chen's equipment reflected both her technical expertise and her determination to leave no tactical advantage unexploited. Her diagnostic systems incorporated machine learning algorithms that could identify patterns in device construction that human analysis might miss, and her approach to bomb disposal integrated lessons learned from cybersecurity, recognizing that modern terrorists increasingly relied on digital triggers and remote activation systems. The respect Chun had earned came at a cost that her male counterparts rarely understood. Every mistake she made was scrutinized more heavily, every success attributed to luck or superior equipment rather than skill, and every training opportunity required her to prove herself worthy in ways that men took for granted. She had learned to be not just competent, but exceptional, because anything less would be interpreted as confirmation that women couldn't handle the psychological pressure of working with devices designed to kill. Master technician Robert Kim had built his reputation on an ability to identify weaknesses in other specialists' techniques and develop training scenarios that exposed those vulnerabilities before they could prove fatal in real-world situations. At 38, he possessed the kind of analytical intelligence that came from studying explosive device construction from the perspective of both defender and attacker, understanding terrorist psychology well enough to predict how they would modify their techniques in response to improved defensive capabilities. Kim's training methodologies incorporated elements of game theory, psychology, and engineering analysis that enabled him to create scenarios that pushed specialists beyond their comfort zones in controlled environments. He could watch another technician work for 10 minutes and identify subtle flaws in their approach that would become magnified under stress, potentially causing hesitation or miscalculation when lives depended on perfect execution. The specialists surrounding the training bay where Maggie had been assigned represented years of competitive excellence at the highest levels of explosive ordnance disposal. They had faced each other in countless simulations, analyzed each other's strengths and weaknesses, and developed strategies for gaining microscopic advantages that could determine success or failure when working with devices that allowed no margin for error. They knew each other's equipment specifications, preferred techniques, and psychological vulnerabilities with the thoroughness of chess masters studying familiar opponents. Each had invested years in developing specialized skills that complemented the advanced technology they relied upon, creating human-machine partnerships that represented the state-of-the-art in explosive device neutralization. The culture these specialists had created valued innovation, technological advancement, and relentless pursuit of improvements that could provide decisive advantages when facing unknown threats. They discussed equipment modifications with the intensity of aerospace engineers, debated neutralization theories with academic precision, and approached training with methodologies borrowed from cognitive psychology research and neuroscience. Studies of decision-making under extreme stress. Maggie's presence violated every assumption this culture was built upon. Her obvious age suggested declining reflexes and deteriorating fine motor control that would handicap performance when working with devices that required precision measured in fractions of millimeters. Her outdated equipment indicated either ignorance of technological developments that had revolutionized the field or inability to access tools that serious professionals considered essential for survival. Her casual demeanor implied a lack of understanding about the intensity and life or death consequences of the training she had somehow gained authorization to participate in. The specialists preparing for the morning's exercises saw confirmation of their superiority in every aspect of her appearance and behavior. They possessed better equipment, superior training, advanced understanding of explosive device construction, and the physical advantages that came from youth and intensive conditioning programs designed to maintain peak performance under conditions that would incapacitate most people. The idea that this woman could contribute anything meaningful to their training environment seemed not just unlikely, but potentially dangerous if her presence created distractions during critical learning opportunities. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As Maggie made her way toward Training Bay 7, carrying her ancient toolkit and moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged, the advanced specialists around her began to take notice. Their morning preparation routine slowed as conversation shifted toward speculation about how someone so obviously unprepared had gained access to their exclusive training environment. The contrast between Maggie's appearance and the high-tech sophistication surrounding her was stark enough to draw attention from across the facility. Security personnel checked their authorization lists twice. Administrative staff made discreet phone calls to verify clearances, and training supervisors began reviewing documentation to understand how someone with such apparently limited qualifications had been approved for participation in exercises designed for America's elite explosive ordnance disposal specialists. The morning sun streaming through the facility's bulletproof windows illuminated a scene that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. A woman who looked like she belonged at a church bake sale preparing to participate in training exercises with specialists whose skills determined whether terrorist attacks succeeded or failed. Using equipment that represented decades of technological advancement in life or death decision-making, Training Bay 7 buzzed with activity as America's most elite explosive ordnance disposal specialists prepared for the morning's advanced simulation exercises. The cavernous space resembled a Hollywood movie set crossed with a surgical operating theater, featuring holographic projection systems that could recreate any terrorist scenario with photorealistic detail and diagnostic equipment capable of analyzing explosive devices down to their molecular composition. When Maggie Sullivan entered the bay and began unpacking her equipment at Station 12, the gradual silence that spread across the facility was almost audible. What emerged from her battered canvas toolkit drew stares that ranged from curiosity to outright disbelief, followed by poorly concealed laughter that rippled through the assembled specialists like a wave breaking against the shore. The first item she withdrew was a magnifying glass with a wooden handle that looked like it had been purchased from a novelty shop sometime during the Eisenhower administration. The lens was scratched and yellowed with age, mounted in a brass setting that showed the kind of tarnish that accumulated over decades of use. Compared to the digital microscopy system surrounding it, which could provide real-time analysis of explosive components at magnifications exceeding 10,000 times, Maggie's magnifying glass looked like a prop from a museum exhibit about detective work in the 1940s. Her wire cutters appeared to have been forged in someone's garage during World War II. The handles were wrapped in electrical tape that had been replaced so many times it created a lumpy, uneven grip, and the cutting edges showed nicks and wear patterns that suggested they had been used to cut everything from fence wire to electrical components over the course of several decades. The specialists around her carried precision cutting instruments manufactured by Swiss toolmakers, featuring laser-guided alignment systems and force feedback mechanisms that could slice through materials with tolerances measured in micrometers. The multimeter she placed carefully on her workstation belonged in a technical museum dedicated to the history of electronic measurement. Its analog display featured a needle that swung across numbered scales, requiring manual interpretation rather than the digital readouts that provided instantaneous analysis of electrical characteristics. The device was housed in a black bakelite case that had probably been cutting-edge technology when television broadcasts were still in black and white. Modern EID specialists relied on handheld computers that could analyze electrical circuits, predict device behavior, and calculate optimal neutralization strategies faster than human thought processes. Maggie's multimeter required her to manually adjust settings, interpret needle positions, and perform calculations using methods that predated electronic computation by several generations. Senior Technician David Walsh was the first to vocalize what everyone in Training Bay 7 was thinking. He approached Maggie's workstation with the expression of someone who had discovered a historical reenactment taking place in the middle of a contemporary training exercise, his eyebrows raised in a mixture of amusement and professional concern. "Ma'am," Walsh said, his voice carrying clearly across the training bay, "I think there might be some confusion about what kind of exercise we're conducting today. This is advanced explosive ordnance disposal training, not a demonstration of antique tool restoration." His comment triggered appreciative chuckles from nearby specialists who had been watching Maggie's preparation with growing bewilderment. Maggie continued organizing her equipment with methodical precision, apparently oblivious to the attention she was drawing. She arranged her tools according to some system that made sense only to her, checking each implement with the kind of familiarity that suggested countless hours of use under conditions that none of the watching specialists could imagine. Her notebook was a composition book with a marbled black and white cover that elementary school students used for their first writing exercises. The pages were filled with handwritten diagrams, calculations, and notes that appeared to have been accumulated over decades of field experience. She consulted these handwritten references while making additional notes with a mechanical pencil that looked like it had been manufactured before calculators became commonplace. Specialist Sarah Chun found herself torn between professional embarrassment and genuine concern as she watched Maggie's preparation routine. Chun had fought hard to establish credibility in a field dominated by men who questioned whether women could handle the psychological pressure of working with devices designed to kill anyone who made mistakes. Seeing another woman arrive at the facility looking so obviously unprepared made Chun cringe with sympathetic humiliation. Someone should probably explain to her that this isn't a hobby electronics class, Chun whispered to her training partner, loud enough to ensure Maggie could hear. We're dealing with devices that can level city blocks. Her equipment looks like it came from a high school science lab that was abandoned in the 1960s. The diagnostic scanner Maggie withdrew from her toolkit appeared to be a handheld metal detector that might have been used by beachcombers searching for lost jewelry in the sand. The device featured a circular detection head connected to a control box with analog gauges and manual adjustment knobs. It looked primitive compared to the advanced imaging systems that surrounded it, which could penetrate multiple layers of material and provide three-dimensional maps of internal device construction in real time. Master Technician Robert Kim approached Maggie's station with the diplomatic bearing of someone about to deliver corrective guidance to a person who clearly needed professional help. His expression combined patience with barely concealed exasperation as he surveyed her collection of antiquated equipment. "Ma'am," Kim said formally, "I'm concerned that there might be some administrative error regarding your participation in today's training. The devices we'll be working with incorporate electronic components that require sophisticated analysis equipment to understand safely. I'm not sure your tools are capable of providing the diagnostic information necessary for successful neutralization." Maggie looked up from her notebook, where she had been making calculations using long division and manual multiplication rather than the electronic calculation systems that other specialists took for granted. Her expression was attentive and interested, as if she were genuinely curious about Kim's professional assessment of her capabilities. "What specifically concerns you about the diagnostic capabilities?" she asked quietly, her tone suggesting someone seeking clarification rather than someone preparing to defend her methods. "These tools have successfully analyzed electronic components before, though I acknowledge they operate differently from modern systems." Kim gestured toward the holographic analysis station that dominated the center of Training Bay 7, where three-dimensional projections could display explosive device schematics with engineering-level detail. Modern terrorist organizations use electronic triggers that incorporate microprocessors, wireless communication systems, and anti-tampering mechanisms that require computer analysis to understand safely. Visual inspection and manual testing methods simply can't provide the information necessary to neutralize contemporary threats. The other specialists in the training bay had begun gathering around Maggie's workstation, drawn by the conversation and the increasingly obvious mismatch between her equipment and the facility's technological sophistication. Their expressions ranged from amused condescension to genuine worry about how someone so obviously unqualified had gained access to training that was restricted to America's most elite professionals. Dr. James Morrison, the facility's director, had been observing the situation from his elevated control booth overlooking the training bay. The conversation between Kim and Maggie, combined with the growing crowd of specialists around her workstation, forced him to leave his administrative duties and address what appeared to be a significant disruption to the morning's carefully planned exercises. Morrison approached with the bearing of someone accustomed to solving complex problems diplomatically, while maintaining the professional standards that made his facility the most respected EOD training center in the world. His 30 years of experience managing elite specialists had taught him to address potentially embarrassing situations with tact while preserving the integrity of programs that could determine whether future terrorist attacks succeeded or failed. Ms. Sullivan, Morrison said formally, consulting the clipboard that contained her authorization documentation, I need to verify that you understand the nature of today's training exercises. We'll be working with simulated nuclear devices that incorporate the most sophisticated electronic systems that contemporary terrorist organizations have access to. The margin for error is essentially zero, and the analytical requirements exceed what traditional diagnostic methods can provide. Maggie's response demonstrated the kind of professional courtesy that distinguished experienced operators from enthusiastic amateurs. She set down her mechanical pencil and gave Morrison her complete attention, her demeanor suggesting someone who understood the seriousness of his concerns and respected his authority to ensure training safety. Dr. Morrison, she replied, I appreciate your concern about equipment compatibility and analytical requirements. These tools represent approaches that were developed for working with devices that incorporated electronic components, though perhaps not the specific technologies that contemporary threats utilize. She paused thoughtfully, as if considering how to explain methodologies that predated the technological revolution that had transformed explosive ordnance disposal. However, she continued, I believe there's value in understanding how to analyze device construction when advanced diagnostic systems aren't available or have been compromised by anti-tampering mechanisms designed to defeat technological approaches. Morrison found himself in an uncomfortable position. Maggie's authorization paperwork was impeccable, bearing signatures from levels of federal authority that he rarely encountered during routine training operations. The clearance codes checked out against databases that required security classifications he seldom needed to access, and her background documentation suggested experience with specialized programs that weren't part of normal law enforcement or military training. Yet her equipment and apparent methodology seemed completely inadequate for the kind of training his facility provided. The cognitive dissonance between her legitimate authorization and her obvious unpreparedness for contemporary EOD work created administrative challenges that Morrison wasn't sure how to resolve diplomatically. Walsh decided to address the situation more directly. He approached Maggie's workstation and pointed toward the advanced robotic systems that formed the centerpiece of modern explosive ordnance disposal methodology. Ma'am, those robots can approach devices from safe distances, analyze their construction using multiple imaging technologies, and execute neutralization procedures without risking human lives. They incorporate artificial intelligence systems that can predict device behavior and identify optimal disarmament strategies faster than human cognition. He gestured toward her collection of hand tools and analog diagnostic equipment. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but what you're proposing is essentially manual bomb disposal using techniques that were considered dangerous even when they were contemporary. Modern threats require technological solutions because the alternative is accepting casualty rates that are completely unacceptable. The specialists surrounding Maggie's workstation nodded in agreement with Walsh's assessment. They had invested years in learning to work with advanced systems that represented the evolution of explosive ordnance disposal from a dangerous manual craft into a scientific discipline that minimized human risk while maximizing neutralization. Effectiveness. Chun decided to join the conversation, her frustration with Maggie's apparent naivety overcoming her natural reluctance to criticize another woman in a male-dominated field. "Ma'am, with all due respect, the devices we train with here incorporate anti-tampering mechanisms specifically designed to kill anyone who attempts manual analysis. They're equipped with motion sensors, vibration detectors, and electronic countermeasures that make traditional approaches suicidal." She pointed toward her own diagnostic station, where computer screens displayed real-time analysis of simulated device components with scientific precision. "These systems can identify every electronic component, predict how they'll respond to different neutralization approaches, and calculate safe procedures before anyone gets within lethal range. What you're suggesting is like trying to perform surgery with a kitchen knife when modern medical equipment is available." The crowd of specialists around Maggie's workstation had grown to include most of the personnel assigned to Training Bay 7. Their morning preparation routines had been abandoned as word spread about the woman with the antique equipment who seemed to believe she could participate in advanced EOD training using methods that belonged in a historical museum. Some pulled out phones to document what appeared to be an administrative error of historic proportions. Already composing messages to colleagues about the day, someone's grandmother had wandered into the most sophisticated bomb disposal training facility in America, carrying equipment that predated the invention of transistors. Others shook their heads in disgust, viewing Maggie's presence as disrespectful to the serious nature of training that prepared specialists for life or death situations, where mistakes could result in mass casualties. The idea that someone so obviously unqualified had somehow gained access to their exclusive training environment suggested administrative failures that undermined the facility's reputation for maintaining the highest professional standards. Kim decided to make one final attempt at diplomatic resolution. "Ma'am, I think what everyone here is trying to communicate is that explosive ordnance disposal has evolved significantly since your equipment was manufactured. The electronic systems, analytical requirements, and safety protocols we use today represent decades of technological advancement, specifically designed to keep specialists alive while neutralizing threats that are more sophisticated than anything previous generations encountered." He gestured broadly toward the advanced equipment surrounding them. "These systems exist because manual approaches proved inadequate for contemporary threats. We're not being elitist or dismissive of traditional methods. We're acknowledging that technology has fundamentally changed both the nature of explosive devices and the requirements for neutralizing them safely." Maggie's response to the growing chorus of professional concern was characteristically understated. She continued organizing her equipment with the same methodical precision she had displayed since arriving, neither defensive about her methods nor apparently intimidated by the superior technology surrounding her. "I understand your concerns," she said quietly, "and I appreciate the expertise you've all developed working with advanced systems. Technology has certainly provided capabilities that weren't available when these tools were contemporary." She patted her battered toolkit affectionately, the gesture suggesting someone acknowledging the limitations of trusted equipment while maintaining confidence in its fundamental reliability. "Perhaps we'll have an opportunity to see how different approaches compare when we encounter scenarios that test both technological capabilities and traditional methodologies," she added, her tone remaining conversational despite the increasingly obvious skepticism of everyone around her. The morning sun climbed higher over the Virginia training facility, casting harsh shadows through the bulletproof windows of Training Bay 7 as the contrast between Maggie's antiquated equipment and the surrounding technological sophistication became impossible to ignore. The stage was set for what promised to be either an educational demonstration of why modern methods had replaced traditional approaches, or a spectacular failure that would become legendary within the EOD community for all the wrong reasons. The first practical exercise of the morning involved analyzing a simulated improvised explosive device that incorporated the kind of sophisticated electronic components that had become standard in contemporary terrorist operations. The device featured multiple triggering mechanisms, anti-tampering systems designed to detect unauthorized interference, and wireless communication capabilities that could receive activation signals from remote locations. When Maggie approached the training station and began her analysis using her collection of vintage tools, the performance she delivered provided fresh ammunition for the specialists who had been questioning her presence since she first unpacked her equipment. Her methodical examination process required nearly 15 minutes to complete what modern diagnostic systems could accomplish in under 60 seconds, and her handwritten notes suggested analytical approaches that seemed to ignore fundamental principles of electronic engineering. The robotic analysis system that Walsh operated completed its comprehensive scan in 47 seconds, producing a three-dimensional holographic display that revealed every component, connection, and potential failure point within the simulated device. The artificial intelligence incorporated into the system had already calculated 17 different neutralization strategies, ranked them according to success probability, and identified the optimal approach based on current environmental conditions and available equipment. Maggie's analysis, by contrast, involved holding her magnifying glass at various angles while making observations that seemed to rely on visual inspection rather than electronic measurement. She consulted charts in her notebook that appeared to be hand-drawn diagrams of electronic components, cross-referencing them with calculation tables that had been compiled using arithmetic methods rather than computer modeling. "This is painful to watch," Chung commented loudly enough for most of Training Bay 7 to hear. "She's trying to analyze a 21st century explosive device using 19th century methodology. It's like watching someone attempt brain surgery with a butter knife." The electronic signature analysis that formed the foundation of modern EOD work was completely beyond the capabilities of Maggie's equipment. Her multimeter could detect basic electrical characteristics like voltage and resistance, but it couldn't identify the specific microprocessors, wireless transceivers, and digital logic circuits that determined how contemporary devices functioned. Modern threats incorporated components that operated at frequencies and power levels that required sophisticated measurement equipment to detect safely. The anti-tampering systems alone used electronic countermeasures that could identify unauthorized scanning attempts and trigger immediate detonation if they detected the kind of crude electrical probing that Maggie's tools would necessarily employ. Kim approached the training supervisor with growing concern about the safety implications of allowing someone so obviously unqualified to continue participating in exercises that simulated real-world scenarios where mistakes had fatal consequences. "Sir, I'm genuinely worried that she doesn't understand the danger she's creating for herself and everyone around her. Those detection methods would trigger every anti-tampering system that modern terrorists incorporate into their devices." Dr. Morrison found himself trapped between administrative requirements that mandated allowing authorized personnel to participate in training, professional responsibility for maintaining safety standards that protected specialists from unnecessary risks. Maggie's authorization documentation remained impeccable, but her performance suggested capabilities that were completely inadequate for the training scenarios his facility provided. The morning's second exercise involved a simulated chemical detection scenario where specialists had to identify explosive compounds while working in environmental suits that limited visibility and manual dexterity. The advanced detection systems used mass spectrometry and gas chromatography to analyze molecular compositions with scientific precision, providing instantaneous identification of specific chemicals and their concentrations. Maggie's approach to chemical analysis involved opening small vials that contained liquid reagents, applying drops to test samples, and observing color changes that indicated the presence of different compounds. Her methodology looked like something from a high school chemistry experiment, requiring visual interpretation of results that modern systems could quantify with mathematical precision. "She's literally sniffing explosive residues," Walsh announced, incredulously as he watched Maggie's testing procedure through the observation window. Professional training emphasizes avoiding any direct exposure to unknown chemicals, and she's conducting analysis that requires physical contact with potentially lethal substances. The specialists watching from the safety of the observation deck found themselves confronting a demonstration of everything they had been taught not to do when working with explosive materials. Maggie's hands-on approach violated fundamental safety protocols that had been developed through decades of learning from fatal mistakes made by previous generations of bomb disposal specialists. Her willingness to work directly with potentially dangerous materials suggested either ignorance of contemporary safety requirements or confidence in abilities that seemed completely unjustified based on her equipment and apparent training background. Either possibility created concerns about her mental state and judgment that extended beyond mere technical incompetence. The third exercise of the morning tested specialists' ability to work under time pressure while analyzing devices that incorporated multiple redundant triggering systems. Modern approaches relied on parallel processing capabilities that could simultaneously examine different components while maintaining constant communication with support teams who provided real-time guidance and backup analysis. Maggie's sequential approach to component analysis meant that she fell further behind the acceptable time limits with each element she examined. Her note-taking process alone consumed minutes that contemporary specialists used for actual neutralization procedures, and her manual calculations required arithmetic operations that electronic systems performed instantaneously. At this rate, she'll still be taking notes when the rest of us have finished the entire exercise, Thompson observed while watching Maggie's painstakingly slow progress. This isn't thorough analysis. It's a demonstration of why modern methods replaced traditional approaches. The psychological pressure component of EOD training was designed to test specialists' ability to maintain perfect composure while working with devices that could detonate without warning. The exercises incorporated realistic time constraints, environmental stressors, and simulated emergency conditions that replicated the chaos and urgency of actual terrorist incidents. Maggie's response to pressure appeared to involve slowing down, rather than maintaining the rapid decision-making pace that characterized effective bomb disposal work. When time limits were imposed, she continued her methodical examination process without apparent regard for the clock, suggesting either misunderstanding of the exercise requirements or inability to adapt her techniques to contemporary operational demands. "She's treating this like a leisurely hobby project instead of emergency response training," Chun complained during the mid-morning break. "In real situations, devices are designed to detonate after specific time intervals. Her approach would guarantee catastrophic failure because she can't complete analysis quickly enough to matter." The facility's advanced training simulators incorporated stress factors that tested specialists' psychological resilience under conditions that approximated real-world terrorist scenarios. Background noise simulated urban environments, lighting conditions replicated work in damaged buildings, and communication systems introduced the kind of interference that specialists encountered during actual emergencies. Maggie's performance under these simulated stress conditions revealed additional limitations that reinforced everyone's assessment of her inadequacy for contemporary EOD work. Her analog equipment provided no backup systems or redundant information sources, meaning that any failure or interference would leave her completely without diagnostic capabilities. Modern specialists carried multiple independent analysis systems that could cross-verify results and provide alternative approaches if primary systems failed or were compromised by electronic countermeasures. Maggie's reliance on single point-of-failure equipment meant that any problem with her tools would render her completely helpless in emergency situations. Walsh decided to address the situation more directly during the break between exercises. He approached Maggie's workstation with the expression of someone who had moved beyond amusement to genuine professional concern about safety violations and administrative failures that allowed unqualified personnel access to elite training programs. "Ma'am," Walsh said, his tone more serious than his earlier comments, "I think we need to have an honest conversation about what's happening here. Your equipment isn't just outdated, it's actually dangerous to use with contemporary explosive devices. The electrical probing techniques your tools require would trigger immediate detonation from any anti-tampering system manufactured in the last 20 years. He pointed toward the advanced analysis stations surrounding them. "These systems exist specifically because manual approaches proved fatal when terrorists began incorporating electronic countermeasures into their devices. We're not using technology for convenience. We're using it because it's the only way to survive contact with modern threats." Maggie's response maintained the same calm professionalism she had displayed throughout the morning, despite the increasingly personal nature of the criticism being directed toward her methods and qualifications. She looked up from her notebook, where she had been documenting observations from the morning's exercises using handwritten notes and hand-drawn diagrams. "I understand your concerns about electronic countermeasures and anti-tampering systems," she replied quietly. "Contemporary devices certainly incorporate sophisticated protection mechanisms that respond to electronic scanning attempts. However, there are situations where technological approaches may not be available or may have been specifically compromised by device designers who understand modern analytical methods." Her acknowledgement of the limitations inherent in her approach seemed to embolden Walsh further. "Ma'am, with all due respect, those situations simply don't exist anymore. Federal response protocols ensure that appropriate technological resources are available for any scenario we're likely to encounter. The idea that specialists would need to rely on manual analysis belongs to a historical period that ended decades ago." Kim joined the conversation with the bearing of someone providing educational guidance to a person who clearly needed professional development. The margin for error in contemporary EOD work is measured in microseconds and microvolts. Anti-tampering systems can detect electrical changes that are smaller than what human senses can perceive, even with magnification equipment. Manual approaches aren't just ineffective, they're guaranteed to trigger defensive mechanisms. The crowd of specialists who had gathered around Maggie's workstation during the break represented some of the most experienced bomb disposal experts in America. Their combined knowledge encompassed decades of real-world experience with terrorist devices, academic training in advanced electronic engineering, and practical expertise with cutting-edge neutralization technologies. Their unanimous assessment of Maggie's methods as dangerously obsolete carried the weight of professional consensus among people whose lives depended on accurate evaluation of technical capabilities and tactical effectiveness. The idea that traditional approaches could compete with modern systems seemed not just unlikely but delusionally dangerous. Chun decided to make the educational argument more explicit. "Ma'am, the reason we use these advanced systems isn't preference or convenience, it's survival. Terrorist organizations specifically design their devices to kill anyone who attempts manual analysis. They study traditional EOD techniques and incorporate countermeasures that exploit exactly the kind of direct contact approaches your equipment requires." She gestured toward the holographic analysis station that dominated the training bay. "These systems can examine devices without triggering defensive mechanisms because they use non-invasive scanning technologies that operate outside the detection parameters that anti-tampering systems monitor. What you're proposing is essentially announcing your presence to devices that are designed to kill intruders. The afternoon training scenarios were designed to test specialists' ability to work collaboratively while managing complex devices that required coordination between multiple team members. Modern EOD operations relied on distributed analysis capabilities where different specialists could simultaneously examine separate components while maintaining constant communication through digital networks. Maggie's individual approach to device analysis made her incompatible with contemporary team coordination protocols. Her inability to interface with electronic communication systems meant that she couldn't receive real-time guidance from support personnel or share analytical results with other team members who might be working on related components. She's operating in complete isolation from the support systems that make modern EOD work survivable, Thompson observed while watching Maggie's solo approach to a simulated team exercise. Contemporary threats require collaborative analysis. Because individual specialists can't possibly understand every aspect of sophisticated devices, her methodology assumes capabilities that no single person possesses anymore. The psychological evaluation component of the training program was designed to identify specialists who might struggle with the mental demands of working with devices that could kill them instantly if they made mistakes. The assessment involved monitoring stress responses, decision-making patterns, and adaptability under pressure that characterized effective bomb disposal professionals. Maggie's psychological profile during the exercises raised additional concerns about her suitability for contemporary EOD work. Her apparent comfort with direct physical contact with potentially explosive materials suggested either misunderstanding of the actual dangers involved or psychological abnormalities that could indicate poor judgment under stress. Modern specialists maintained healthy respect for the lethal capabilities of the devices they worked with, understanding that survival depended on maintaining appropriate psychological distance while working through technological intermediaries that provided safety margins. Maggie's willingness to handle simulated explosive components directly suggested psychological approaches that had proven fatal for specialists who underestimated contemporary threats. By the end of the morning's training session, the consensus among the assembled specialists was unanimous. Maggie Sullivan represented everything that modern explosive ordnance disposal training was designed to overcome. Her methods, equipment, and apparent psychological approach to bomb disposal belonged to a historical period that had ended because those techniques proved inadequate for contemporary threats. The afternoon would bring scenarios that tested specialists' abilities under conditions that more closely approximated real-world terrorist incidents, where the margin for error disappeared entirely and survival depended on technological capabilities that Maggie's equipment simply couldn't provide. The stage was set for what appeared to be either an educational demonstration of why traditional methods had been abandoned, or a spectacular failure that would reinforce every assumption the specialists had made about the superiority of modern approaches. The atmosphere in Training Bay 7 had shifted dramatically by the time the afternoon scenarios began. What had started as amused curiosity about Maggie's outdated equipment had evolved into genuine frustration among the specialists, who felt their valuable training time was being wasted on someone who clearly didn't belong in their elite program. The morning's exercises had confirmed every assumption they'd made about her inadequacy, and the prospect of spending additional hours watching her fumble through advanced scenarios was testing their professional patience. Dr. Morrison found himself facing increasing pressure from his most experienced personnel to address what they viewed as an administrative failure that was compromising the quality of training that their careers depended upon. Walsh had already approached him twice during the lunch break, requesting private meetings to discuss the situation that was disrupting their carefully planned exercises. Shun had submitted a formal written complaint through proper channels, documenting safety concerns and requesting clarification about authorization procedures that allowed unqualified personnel access to restricted training programs. The afternoon's first scenario was designed to test specialists' ability to work with what the intelligence community classified as adaptive devices, explosive systems that incorporated artificial intelligence capabilities and could modify their behavior in response to neutralization attempts. These represented the cutting edge of terrorist technology, devices that learned from each interaction and became more difficult to defeat as specialists worked with them. The challenge required teams of specialists working in coordination, sharing real-time analysis through secure communication networks while their individual diagnostic systems fed information into collective databases that tracked device responses and predicted optimal neutralization strategies. Success demanded seamless integration between human expertise and technological capabilities, with failure modes that could cascade rapidly beyond any individual's ability to control. Maggie's preparation for this scenario involved the same methodical organization of her analog tools that had characterized her approach throughout the day. She arranged her magnifying glass, wire cutters, and antique multimeter with careful precision while consulting her handwritten notes and making additional calculations using arithmetic methods that predated electronic computation by several generations. The contrast between her solitary preparation and the collaborative technological symphony surrounding her was stark, enough to draw renewed attention from specialists who had thought they'd seen the full extent of her inadequacy during the morning exercises. The adaptive device scenario required capabilities that simply didn't exist outside of contemporary technological systems, making her participation seem not just futile but potentially dangerous for team members who would have to work around her limitations. Walsh decided that the situation had progressed beyond diplomatic concern into active interference with critical training objectives. He approached Dr. Morrison with the expression of someone who had reached the limits of professional tolerance for administrative decisions that compromised operational effectiveness. "Sir," Walsh said formally, "I need to request that Ms. Sullivan be reassigned to observational status for the remainder of today's exercises. The adaptive device scenario requires real-time electronic coordination that her equipment simply cannot provide. Her participation creates safety risks for other team members and prevents us from practicing the collaborative techniques that we'll need in actual emergency situations." Morrison reviewed Maggie's authorization documentation one more time, searching for any indication that her clearance level included provisions for observational participation rather than full exercise involvement. The paperwork remained frustratingly complete and legitimate, with signatures from federal authorities who rarely involved themselves in routine training operations and authorization codes that checked out against classification levels he seldom encountered. Her documentation specifically authorizes full participation in all training scenarios, Morrison replied reluctantly. "Without explicit guidance from the authorities who signed these orders, I don't have discretion to modify her access or participation level." The implications of Morrison's statement were not lost on the specialists who understood that federal authorization at such levels typically involved considerations that extended far beyond routine training operations. Someone with significant authority had specifically ensured that Maggie would have complete access to their most advanced scenarios, suggesting purposes or background information that weren't apparent from her obvious technical limitations. Chun approached the group with growing exasperation about what she viewed as administrative failures that undermined the professional standards that made their training program respected throughout the federal law enforcement and military communities. Her frustration was compounded by recognition that questioning Maggie's qualifications might reflect poorly on her own judgment. If the older woman's authorization came from sources that Chun wasn't senior enough to understand. "Dr. Morrison," Chun said carefully, "I'm concerned that the adaptive device scenario represents a significant escalation in complexity and danger from this morning's exercises. The safety protocols for working with learning systems require constant electronic monitoring and immediate response capabilities that traditional methods simply can't provide. If something goes wrong during Ms. Sullivan's analysis attempts, the consequences could affect everyone in the training bay. Her concern was technically accurate and professionally reasonable. Adaptive devices were designed to identify patterns in neutralization attempts and develop countermeasures that defeated standard approaches. The artificial intelligence systems incorporated into these scenarios could modify device behavior faster than human cognition could adapt, requiring technological intervention to maintain safe working conditions. Maggie's analog approach to device analysis would provide no early warning if an adaptive system began implementing defensive measures designed to prevent neutralization. Her inability to monitor electronic responses in real time meant that she could trigger escalating countermeasures without realizing that the device was actively working to defeat her efforts. Kim joined the conversation with additional technical arguments about the incompatibility between traditional methods and contemporary training requirements. Sir, the learning algorithms in adaptive devices are specifically programmed to identify and counter manual analysis techniques. They recognize electrical probing patterns, mechanical manipulation attempts, and timing characteristics that human operators produce. Ms. Sullivan's methodology would essentially teach the device how to defeat traditional approaches more effectively. The group of specialists surrounding Dr. Morrison represented collective expertise that encompassed decades of experience with the most sophisticated explosive devices that terrorist organizations had developed. Their unanimous assessment that Maggie's participation in advanced scenarios created unacceptable risks carried the weight of professional consensus among people whose survival depended on accurate evaluation of tactical capabilities. Thompson decided to address the broader implications of allowing obviously inadequate personnel to participate in training that prepared specialists for life or death situations. Sir, beyond the immediate safety concerns, there's a question about the integrity of our training program. Other agencies send their personnel here because they trust our standards and evaluation methods. If word spreads that we're allowing unqualified participants access to advanced scenarios, it could undermine confidence in our entire certification process. The reputation of the Federal EAD Training Center was built on rigorous standards that ensured only the most capable specialists gained access to cutting-edge techniques and technologies. Agencies throughout the federal government relied on Morrison's facility to provide training that met the highest professional standards, with certification processes that guaranteed competence under the most demanding conditions. Morrison found himself weighing administrative requirements against professional obligations in ways that his decades of experience hadn't prepared him to handle. Maggie's legitimate authorization created legal obligations to provide access, but the safety concerns raised by his most experienced specialists represented professional responsibilities that he couldn't ignore without potentially catastrophic consequences. I understand everyone's concerns, Morrison said slowly, and I share your assessment of the technical challenges involved. However, I'm bound by the authorization documentation until I receive explicit guidance from the authorities who signed these orders. He paused, studying the faces of the specialists who had gathered around him. Perhaps we can structure the afternoon scenarios to minimize risk while honoring the administrative requirements. Walsh found this compromise completely unacceptable from both safety and professional development perspectives. The adaptive device scenarios represented some of the most valuable training opportunities that specialists would encounter during their careers, providing experience with threat technologies that they might not encounter again until facing actual terrorist incidents. Sir, modifying the scenarios to accommodate equipment limitations defeats the purpose of advanced training, Walsh argued. These exercises are designed to push specialists to their limits using cutting-edge technologies under realistic stress conditions. Compromising the challenge level to accommodate traditional methods undermines the training value for everyone involved. The conversation was interrupted by an announcement from the facility's communications center that immediately changed the dynamics of everything happening in Training Bay 7. The voice over the intercom carried the kind of urgent authority that made experienced specialists stop whatever they were doing and pay complete attention. All personnel in Training Bay 7, this is Control. We have just received notification of an actual emergency situation that requires immediate specialist response. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. The transformation in the training bay was instantaneous. Specialists who had been arguing about Maggie's qualifications immediately shifted into emergency response mode, abandoning their personal equipment to access the advanced deployment systems that were maintained for actual crisis situations. The holographic displays that had been showing training scenarios switched to real-time intelligence feeds from federal agencies, tracking an active terrorist incident. Dr. Morrison's voice joined the communications from Control, providing additional details that made everyone in the facility understand that their training day had just become an actual operational deployment. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reports of a suspected nuclear device that has been located in downtown Richmond, Virginia. Initial analysis suggests electronic components that may be beyond the capabilities of local EOD teams. Federal authorities are requesting immediate deployment of our most experienced specialists. The intelligence briefing that followed provided details that sent chills through even the most experienced personnel in the facility. The device incorporated electronic systems that had defeated multiple analysis attempts by regional EOD teams, with anti-tampering mechanisms that had already triggered secondary explosive charges when approached with standard diagnostic equipment. Local authorities had evacuated a 12-block radius, but the potential blast zone for a nuclear device would require evacuation of the entire metropolitan area. Chun felt her stomach drop as she realized the implications of deploying to work with a device that had already proven capable of defeating contemporary analytical approaches. The failure of standard technological methods suggested threat capabilities that exceeded anything covered in their training scenarios, with electronic countermeasures that had specifically defeated the advanced systems they relied upon for survival. Kim studied the intelligence displays with growing concern about the technical challenges involved in neutralizing a device that had apparently been designed to counter modern EOD methodologies. The reported electronic signature suggested artificial intelligence capabilities that could learn from each neutralization attempt and develop increasingly sophisticated countermeasures in real time. Walsh realized that they were facing exactly the kind of adaptive threat that their afternoon training scenarios had been designed to prepare them for, except that failure would result in actual casualties rather than educational feedback. The device's ability to defeat multiple analysis attempts suggested technological sophistication that pushed the boundaries of what even their most advanced systems could handle effectively. As the specialists prepared for emergency deployment, gathering their most sophisticated equipment and reviewing protocols for working with unknown nuclear threats, Maggie continued organizing her analog tools with the same methodical precision she had displayed throughout the day. Her apparent calm in the face of an actual emergency stood in stark contrast to the urgent activity surrounding her. "Ma'am," Morrison said, approaching her workstation with the expression of someone who had suddenly realized that administrative procedures might be irrelevant in the face of actual crisis. "This deployment involves a confirmed nuclear threat that has already defeated multiple neutralization attempts. I strongly recommend that you remain here while our most experienced specialists handle the emergency response." Maggie looked up from her toolkit, meeting Morrison's gaze with calm brown eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience that none of the specialists around her had noticed before. "Dr. Morrison," she said quietly, "if the device has defeated standard technological approaches, Perhaps it's time to consider whether alternative methodologies might provide solutions that contemporary systems can't achieve. Her response hung in the air of Training Bay 7, like a challenge that couldn't be ignored, suggesting possibilities that none of the assembled specialists had considered, and capabilities that her morning's performance had seemed to completely contradict. The helicopter ride to Richmond took 43 minutes through Virginia, airspace that had been cleared of all civilian traffic by federal aviation authorities. The military transport carried 6 of the facility's most experienced specialists along with their most advanced diagnostic and neutralization equipment, representing America's best hope for preventing what intelligence analysts were already calling the most sophisticated nuclear terrorist threat in the nation's history. Maggie sat quietly in the corner of the aircraft's cargo bay, her ancient toolkit secured beside her while the other specialists made final preparations with equipment worth millions of dollars. The contrast between her calm demeanor and the urgent activity surrounding her was stark enough to draw renewed attention from personnel, who were struggling to understand how someone so obviously unprepared had been included in an emergency deployment that would determine whether hundreds of thousands of people lived or died. Dr. Morrison had made 3 separate attempts during the flight to convince Maggie to remain in the command vehicle when they reached the crisis site, arguing that her safety and the mission's success both demanded that she observe rather than participate in neutralization attempts against a device that had already proven lethal to specialists using standard approaches. Each time, Maggie had politely declined, maintaining that her authorization required her participation and suggesting that circumstances might demand capabilities that conventional wisdom considered obsolete. The intelligence briefing during the flight painted a picture that made even the most experienced specialists question whether their training had prepared them for the technological sophistication they were about to encounter. The device had been discovered in the basement of a federal building during a routine security sweep, concealed within what appeared to be standard electrical infrastructure, until closer examination revealed electronic components that exceeded anything in known terrorist arsenals. Initial analysis, attempts by local EOD teams had triggered defensive responses that demonstrated artificial intelligence capabilities beyond current threat assessments. The device had successfully identified and countered electronic scanning attempts, mechanical approach patterns, and even the specific radio frequencies that federal agencies used for coordination during emergency operations. Each neutralization attempt had resulted in the device implementing increasingly sophisticated countermeasures, suggesting learning algorithms that were adapting faster than human operators could modify their approaches. Walsh studied the technical specifications displayed on his tablet computer, trying to understand how terrorist organizations had acquired artificial intelligence capabilities that exceeded what many federal agencies possessed. The device's electronic signature suggested quantum processing components that were theoretically beyond current manufacturing capabilities, with power requirements that should have made concealment impossible in standard building infrastructure. This doesn't make sense from an engineering perspective, Walsh said, showing his analysis to Chun and Kim. The processing power needed to run adaptive countermeasures in real time would require cooling systems and electrical infrastructure that would be obvious to building maintenance. Either our intelligence about terrorist technological capabilities is completely wrong, or we're dealing with something that doesn't fit known threat categories. Chun reviewed the failure reports from previous neutralization attempts, looking for patterns that might suggest weaknesses in the device's defensive systems. What she found was more disturbing than helpful. The device appeared to be learning from each encounter, developing increasingly effective countermeasures that specifically targeted the electronic signatures and approach methodologies that contemporary EOD equipment produced. It's specifically designed to defeat our equipment, Chun realized. The countermeasures aren't random defensive responses. They're targeted attacks against the exact frequencies, power levels, and analytical patterns that our systems use. Someone built this device with detailed knowledge of federal EOD capabilities. The implications of Chun's assessment sent chills through the specialists who understood that their technological advantages had been systematically neutralized by opponents who possessed intimate knowledge of their methods and equipment. The device wasn't just sophisticated. It was specifically engineered to exploit the dependence on electronic systems that defined modern explosive ordnance disposal. Kim reached the same conclusion through different analysis, studying the timeline of defensive responses that showed the device's learning curve accelerating with each neutralization attempt. It's not just adapting to our equipment. It's getting better at defeating us. Each team that's tried to work with it has actually made it more dangerous for the next attempt. The helicopter began its descent toward the Richmond crisis site, where the view through the aircraft windows revealed the scope of the emergency response that had been mobilized. Evacuation zones extended for miles in every direction, with federal, state, and local agencies coordinating the largest civilian displacement in Virginia's history. Emergency services had established command centers outside the potential blast radius, but everyone understood that nuclear devices could produce effects that made geographical distance irrelevant for large portions of the metropolitan area. Morrison's radio crackled with updates from the ground command center that provided additional details about the challenges waiting for them. The device's location in the basement of a federal building had been selected to maximize psychological impact and complicate neutralization efforts. Access required descending through multiple levels of government infrastructure while carrying equipment that the device had already proven capable of detecting and countering. "Ground control to deployment team," the radio announced. "Be advised that the device has responded to our preparation activities by activating additional electronic systems. We're detecting new power signatures and communication attempts that weren't present during initial discovery. It appears to be aware that additional specialists are en route." The information that the device could monitor federal communications and respond to deployment activities represented a level of technological integration that exceeded anything in contemporary threat assessments. The artificial intelligence wasn't just defending against direct neutralization attempts. It was actively gathering intelligence about response efforts and modifying its defensive posture accordingly. Thompson studied the building schematics that had been uploaded to his tactical display, identifying potential approach routes that might avoid the electronic detection systems that had defeated previous teams. What he found was discouraging. The device's location required passage through corridors lined with federal communication infrastructure that would make electronic concealment impossible, even with the most advanced stealth technologies. "There's no way to approach that location without triggering every detection system the device has available," Thompson concluded. "It's positioned to have advance warning of any neutralization attempt, with enough time to implement countermeasures before we can even begin analysis." The helicopter touched down in a staging area that had been established outside the device's known detection range, where command vehicles and support equipment created a technological city dedicated to coordinating the most complex EOD operation in federal history. Specialists from multiple agencies had gathered with equipment representing the absolute pinnacle of explosive ordnance disposal capability, creating redundant analytical and neutralization systems that should have been capable of defeating any known threat. Yet the device in the federal building basement had already proven that contemporary technological superiority meant nothing against artificial intelligence systems that had been specifically designed to exploit the electronic dependencies that modern EOD work required. The failure of standard approaches had created a crisis that traditional solutions couldn't address, leaving federal authorities searching for alternatives that didn't exist within established protocols and procedures. Maggie emerged from the helicopter carrying her battered canvas toolkit, moving with the same unhurried confidence she had displayed throughout the day at the training facility. The contrast between her analog equipment and the millions of dollars worth of cutting-edge technology surrounding the command site was stark enough to draw attention from federal officials, who were struggling to understand how someone so obviously unprepared had been included in an operation that represented America's last hope for preventing catastrophic casualties. Agent Rebecca Foster, the federal coordinator for the crisis response, approached Morrison with the expression of someone who had been managing impossible situations for hours and was running out of options that made sense within established emergency protocols. Dr. Morrison, I need to understand why civilian personnel have been included in this deployment. We're dealing with a threat that has already killed 2 specialists and wounded 4 others. This isn't a training exercise. Morrison found himself explaining authorization procedures and clearance documentation to someone whose authority exceeded his own, while trying to maintain professional standards that seemed increasingly irrelevant in the face of actual crisis. Agent Foster, Ms. Sullivan, carries federal authorization from levels of command that I rarely encounter. Her documentation specifically requires full participation in all scenarios, including emergency deployments. Foster reviewed Maggie's paperwork with the expression of someone who had seen enough federal bureaucracy to recognize authorization that came from sources she didn't have clearance to question. The signatures and classification codes indicated involvement from agencies and programs that operated well above the level of routine emergency response, suggesting purposes and background information that weren't accessible through normal administrative channels. I don't have time to verify authorization through proper channels, Foster said reluctantly. But I need to be clear that this device has capabilities that exceed our analytical and neutralization resources. We're essentially operating without technological advantages for the first time in decades. The briefing that followed provided details that made everyone present understand that they were facing a terrorist threat that had been specifically designed to defeat every capability that federal agencies possessed. The device incorporated multiple nuclear components that could be triggered through various electronic, mechanical, and temporal mechanisms, with artificial intelligence systems that could modify activation procedures faster than human operators could adapt their neutralization approaches. Local EOD teams had managed to establish that the device contained enough nuclear material to devastate the entire Richmond metropolitan area, but their analysis attempts had triggered defensive responses that made additional electronic scanning impossible without accepting unacceptable casualty risks. The device's learning algorithms had specifically identified and countered every technological approach that contemporary explosive ordnance disposal relied upon for survival. Walsh approached the command vehicle displays that showed real-time monitoring data from the federal building, studying electronic signatures that revealed the device's active countermeasure systems. What he saw confirmed his worst fears about their technological disadvantages. The device was actively jamming every frequency that federal equipment used, generating electronic interference that would make their advanced diagnostic systems useless. It's not just defending against our equipment, Walsh realized. It's actively attacking our technological capabilities. Every electronic system we carry will be compromised before we can get close enough to begin analysis. Chun studied the building's internal monitoring systems, which showed the device's responses to various stimuli that had been tested during previous neutralization attempts. The patterns revealed artificial intelligence that was learning from each interaction, developing increasingly sophisticated defensive measures that specifically targeted the electronic signatures that modern EOD equipment produced. Standard approaches aren't just ineffective, Chun concluded. They're actually making the situation worse. Each time we've tried to use contemporary methods, the device has learned how to defeat those approaches more effectively. We're training it to kill us. The assembled specialists found themselves confronting a situation that their years of training and technological expertise had not prepared them to handle. The device represented a technological paradigm shift that made their advanced equipment liabilities rather than assets, creating requirements for approaches that existed outside contemporary EOD doctrine and capabilities. Kim realized that the crisis demanded solutions that their advanced training had specifically taught them to avoid. We need neutralization methods that don't rely on electronic systems, approaches that can't be detected by artificial intelligence, techniques that operate outside the parameters that the device's countermeasures are designed to address. Thompson reached the same conclusion through different analysis. We need someone who can work with explosive devices using methods that predate the technological dependencies that this device was built to exploit. As these realizations spread through the assembled specialists and federal officials, attention gradually focused on the one person present who possessed exactly the capabilities that contemporary wisdom had dismissed as obsolete and dangerous. Maggie stood quietly beside her ancient toolkit, apparently unaffected by the crisis surrounding her, maintaining the same calm professionalism that had characterized her behavior throughout the day. Agent Foster approached Maggie with the expression of someone who had exhausted all conventional options and was facing the possibility that unconventional approaches might represent their only hope for preventing catastrophic casualties. Miss Sullivan, I need to ask directly, do you believe your equipment and methods could analyze this device without triggering the electronic countermeasures that have defeated our technological approaches? Maggie's response was characteristically measured and professional, acknowledging both the dangers involved and the limitations of her analog methods, while suggesting possibilities that none of the assembled experts had considered. Agent Foster, my equipment operates outside the electronic parameters that the device appears to be monitoring. However, working without technological safety margins involves risks that contemporary training doctrine considers unacceptable. The implications of her statement hung in the crisis air like a lifeline that might save hundreds of thousands of lives, or a death sentence that would add to the casualties that technological approaches had already produced. The moment of truth had arrived, demanding decisions that would determine whether America's most sophisticated nuclear terrorist threat would be defeated by the same methods that contemporary wisdom had dismissed as obsolete and dangerous. Agent Foster's decision to authorize Maggie's approach to the nuclear device came after 37 minutes of consultation with federal authorities whose classifications exceeded anything the assembled specialists had clearance to understand. The secure communications that crackled between the Richmond command site and Washington involved discussions at levels of government that typically remained invisible during routine crisis management, suggesting that Maggie's background encompassed considerations that extended far beyond explosive ordnance disposal training. The transformation in the federal response began subtly, with small changes in protocol and communication procedures that indicated someone with extraordinary authority had intervened in the crisis management process. Additional security personnel arrived via unmarked helicopters, establishing perimeters that excluded even federal officials who lacked specific clearances. Communication channels were switched to encryption levels that required authorization codes. Most of the assembled specialists had never encountered. Dr. Morrison found himself receiving instructions from sources he hadn't known existed within the Federal Emergency Response Structure, with guidance that came from officials whose names weren't in any organizational chart he'd ever seen. The orders were explicit and non-negotiable: provide Margaret Sullivan with complete operational authority and unlimited support for any approach she deemed necessary to neutralize the nuclear threat. All personnel are hereby directed to consider Ms. Sullivan the primary specialist for this operation, Morrison announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from levels of command none of them had imagined were involved in the crisis. Federal directive requires complete compliance with her tactical decisions and operational requirements. The specialists who had spent the day questioning Maggie's qualifications found themselves confronting official recognition of her authority that came from sources powerful enough to override every normal protocol and procedure. Walsh-chan. Kim and Thompson exchanged glances that reflected their growing understanding that they had completely misread the situation from the moment Maggie first appeared at the training facility. Agent Foster approached Maggie with the formal deference that federal officials reserved for individuals whose backgrounds warranted respect they couldn't openly acknowledge. Miss Sullivan, you have complete operational authority for neutralizing this threat. Federal resources are at your disposal, and all personnel will comply with your directives. Maggie's response demonstrated the kind of professional grace that distinguished truly exceptional individuals from merely competent ones. She accepted the operational authority without arrogance or satisfaction, acknowledging the responsibility while maintaining the same calm demeanor she had displayed throughout the crisis. Thank you, Agent Foster. I'll need to examine the device directly to determine the most appropriate neutralization approach. My methods will require working in proximity to the nuclear components, which involves risks that contemporary safety protocols consider unacceptable. Her acknowledgement of the dangers involved only enhanced the respect that was beginning to replace the morning's dismissive attitudes. The descent into the federal building's basement levels revealed the full scope of the technological sophistication they were confronting. The device occupied most of a room that had been designed to house communication equipment, with nuclear components integrated into what appeared to be standard electrical infrastructure, until closer examination revealed engineering that exceeded anything in known terrorist capabilities. Electronic displays throughout the basement showed the device's active monitoring systems tracking their approach, with countermeasure algorithms adjusting in real time as it detected the electronic signatures of their equipment. The artificial intelligence was clearly aware of their presence and was actively preparing defensive responses based on analysis of their technological capabilities. Maggie's first action upon reaching the device surprised everyone present. Instead of beginning immediate analysis with her analog tools, she spent several minutes simply observing the nuclear device from different angles, making notes in her composition book while studying construction details that contemporary diagnostic systems had been unable to examine safely. The device incorporates components that are definitely beyond current terrorist manufacturing capabilities, she said quietly, more to herself than to the assembled specialists. But the integration patterns suggest engineering approaches that were developed for different operational requirements than contemporary threats typically involve. Her observations were accompanied by sketches in her notebook that demonstrated understanding of nuclear device construction that exceeded what her morning's performance had suggested. The drawings showed component relationships and operational sequences with technical accuracy that indicated familiarity with nuclear engineering principles that weren't part of standard EAD training. Walsh watched Maggie's analysis process with growing confusion about how someone whose equipment had seemed so inadequate could demonstrate technical knowledge that exceeded his own understanding of nuclear device construction. Her sketches revealed insights into the device's design philosophy that electronic analysis had been unable to provide, suggesting experience with nuclear threats that existed outside contemporary training doctrine. The device's response to Maggie's presence was immediate and alarming. Electronic signatures throughout the basement began shifting as the artificial intelligence attempted to analyze her analog equipment and determine appropriate countermeasures. The learning algorithms that had successfully defeated multiple technological approaches seemed confused by Maggie's methods, unable to classify her tools according to known threat categories. It's trying to understand what you're doing, Chun observed, studying the monitoring displays that showed the device's electronic activity levels fluctuating as it encountered analytical approaches that didn't fit its programming parameters. Your equipment operates outside the detection systems it was designed to counter. Maggie nodded acknowledgement while she began connecting her antique multimeter to access points that contemporary specialists would never have considered safe. To touch directly. Her willingness to make physical contact with nuclear device components violated every safety protocol that modern training emphasized. But her movements demonstrated confidence that suggested experience with nuclear threats under conditions that made technological safety margins unavailable. This device was specifically engineered to counter contemporary EOD approaches, she explained while making electrical measurements that required direct contact with potentially lethal components. But the countermeasure systems operate within parameters that assume electronic analysis attempts. Manual methods can examine components that electronic systems can't safely approach. The implications of her assessment began to transform the specialists' understanding of why their technological advantages had proven useless against this particular threat. The device hadn't just been built by sophisticated engineers. It had been designed by someone with intimate knowledge of federal EOD capabilities and specific intent to exploit the electronic dependencies that modern specialists relied upon for survival. Kim studied Maggie's note-taking process with growing respect for analytical approaches he had dismissed as obsolete. Her handwritten calculations were producing insights into nuclear device construction that their advanced computers had been unable to provide, suggesting mathematical methods that could solve problems without triggering the electronic countermeasures that had defeated technological analysis. Your calculations are identifying component relationships that our systems couldn't analyze safely, Kim realized. The manual approach provides information that electronic methods can't access without triggering defensive responses. Thompson found himself reassessing fundamental assumptions about the relationship between technological advancement and operational effectiveness. Maggie's analog methods weren't just avoiding electronic countermeasures. They were providing analytical capabilities that advanced systems couldn't duplicate under the specific conditions this threat had created. Agent Foster's radio crackled with updates from Washington that indicated the federal response was being monitored at the highest levels of government. The secure communications involved officials whose involvement suggested that the nuclear threat represented more than a terrorist incident, possibly including foreign intelligence operations that had specifically targeted American technological capabilities. Washington control to Richmond site, the radio announced. Be advised that preliminary analysis suggests this device incorporates technologies that exceed known terrorist capabilities. Intelligence agencies are investigating possible foreign government involvement in providing artificial intelligence systems specifically designed to defeat federal response protocols. The information that the nuclear threat might involve foreign intelligence operations transformed everyone's understanding of why Maggie's authorization had come from such extraordinary levels of federal authority. Her participation wasn't just about explosive ordnance disposal. It was about confronting threats that had been specifically engineered to exploit American technological dependencies by opponents who possessed detailed knowledge of federal capabilities. Maggie's work with the nuclear device accelerated as she identified critical components that controlled the timing and triggering mechanisms. Her analog tools provided access to electronic systems that the device's countermeasures couldn't monitor or defend against, allowing her to examine nuclear components that contemporary methods couldn't safely approach. I can see the primary trigger mechanism, she announced, her voice remaining calm despite the implications of working directly with nuclear detonation systems. The device uses multiple redundant activation systems that are designed to prevent technological neutralization. However, the mechanical components can be disabled using approaches that don't trigger electronic countermeasures. The specialists watching her work found themselves witnessing capabilities that challenged every assumption they had made about modern explosive ordnance disposal requirements. Maggie's methods weren't just effective. They were providing solutions to problems that technological approaches had been unable to solve. demonstrating that manual techniques retained advantages that advanced systems couldn't duplicate. Walsh's radio crackled with an incoming communication that provided information about Maggie's background that finally explained the morning's confusion about her qualifications and authorization. The voice belonged to Colonel Patricia Hawkins, whose security classification was high enough to override normal communication protocols during federal emergencies. All personnel at Richmond site, Colonel Hawkins announced, be advised that Margaret Sullivan is a former director of the Nuclear Emergency Response Team and holds the federal record for successful nuclear device neutralizations under combat conditions. Her authorization comes directly from the Secretary of Defense and includes operational authority that supersedes local command structure. The revelation that Maggie was not just qualified but legendary within the nuclear emergency response community sent shockwaves through the assembled specialists who had spent the day questioning her presence and mocking her equipment. The woman they had dismissed as an unqualified amateur was actually one of the most experienced nuclear specialists in American history, with achievements that existed at the highest levels of classified operations. Chung felt her stomach drop as she realized the full extent of her professional misjudgment. She had questioned the qualifications of someone whose background included nuclear emergencies that most specialists could only imagine, operations that remained classified decades after their completion, and achievements that placed her among the most respected experts in the field. Kim found himself confronting the reality that his expertise in contemporary methods had blinded him to capabilities that transcended technological limitations. Maggie's analog approaches weren't outdated. They were specialized techniques that had been developed for nuclear threats that exceeded what contemporary training doctrine addressed. Thompson realized that his ability to identify weaknesses in other specialists' techniques had completely failed when confronted with someone whose experience encompassed nuclear scenarios that existed outside normal training parameters. Her methodical approaches represented expertise that had been proven effective under conditions that would have defeated contemporary technological solutions. Morrison understood that the morning's training exercises had provided Maggie with opportunities to observe contemporary EOD capabilities while concealing her own qualifications, allowing her to assess current techniques while maintaining operational security about her true background and experience level. As this information spread through the Richmond command site, federal officials who had been questioning Maggie's inclusion in the emergency response began to understand that her participation represented access to capabilities that existed nowhere else within current federal resources. Her experience with nuclear devices under combat conditions provided exactly the expertise that the current crisis demanded. Agent Foster approached Maggie with renewed respect and growing urgency about the timeline for neutralization. Ms. Sullivan, how much additional time do you need to complete the disarmament process? Maggie looked up from her work with the nuclear device's trigger mechanisms, her hand steady despite working with components that could detonate without warning. Approximately 3 minutes, Agent Foster. The neutralization sequence requires manual disconnection of redundant systems that must be approached in specific order to prevent automatic activation. Her assessment that she could neutralize a nuclear device that had defeated multiple technological approaches in less time than most people needed to make coffee seemed almost impossible to believe. Yet the confidence in her voice suggested someone who had performed similar procedures under conditions that made the current crisis seem routine by comparison. The final 3 minutes would determine whether Margaret Sullivan's legendary reputation was justified and whether analog methods that contemporary wisdom had dismissed as obsolete could succeed where America's most advanced technology had failed catastrophically. The 3 minutes that followed Maggie's assessment were the longest in the professional lives of every specialist present. Working with nuclear components that could vaporize Richmond if mishandled, she moved through the disarmament sequence with methodical precision that demonstrated Decades of experience under conditions that made the current crisis seem routine. By comparison, her hands remained perfectly steady as she disconnected trigger mechanisms using wire cutters that looked like relics from another era, but which had been specifically modified for nuclear work during operations that remained classified. Decades after their completion, each cut was preceded by careful measurement with her antique multimeter, ensuring that electrical isolation was achieved before severing connections that could detonate the device if approached incorrectly. First redundant system neutralized, Maggie announced calmly, her voice carrying none of the tension that filled the basement room. 2 primary trigger mechanisms remaining. Proceeding to secondary electrical isolation. The device's artificial intelligence continued its attempts to understand and counter her methods, but the learning algorithms had been programmed to analyze. Electronic scanning attempts and technological neutralization approaches. Maggie's manual techniques operated outside the parameters that the countermeasure systems could recognize or defend against, creating a technological blind spot that her analog methods exploited perfectly. Walsh watched in fascination as Maggie's apparently primitive equipment provided capabilities that their advanced systems couldn't duplicate. Her magnifying glass revealed component details that electronic imaging couldn't examine safely, while her handwritten calculations identified electrical relationships that computer analysis had been unable to determine without triggering defensive responses. Second trigger system isolated, Maggie continued, moving to the nuclear device's primary detonation mechanism with confidence that came from experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Beginning final neutralization sequence. This component requires complete electrical disconnection while maintaining mechanical stability. The final minute of the disarmament process tested everyone's nerves as Maggie worked with the nuclear device's most sensitive components. The mechanism that controlled nuclear detonation was designed with multiple fail-safe systems that would trigger automatic activation if they detected improper neutralization attempts, requiring perfect understanding of both electrical and mechanical engineering principles. Chun found herself holding her breath as she watched Maggie make the final disconnection using techniques that violated every safety protocol contemporary training emphasized. Yet the results spoke for themselves. The nuclear device's electronic displays went dark as power systems shut down in the precise sequence that indicated successful neutralization rather than catastrophic failure. Device neutralized, Maggie announced, stepping back from the now inert nuclear threat that had defeated America's most advanced technological capabilities. All trigger mechanisms disabled, nuclear components isolated, detonation systems completely disconnected. The silence that followed lasted several seconds as everyone present processed the reality that a nuclear terrorist threat had been neutralized, using equipment that belonged in a museum and techniques that contemporary doctrine considered obsolete and dangerous. The cognitive dissonance was almost overwhelming for specialists who had built their careers on technological superiority and scientific methodology. Agent Foster's radio immediately came alive with communications from Washington, confirming the successful neutralization through monitoring systems that had been tracking the device's electronic signatures. Federal authorities at the highest levels of government were receiving real-time confirmation that the nuclear crisis had been resolved by someone whose methods had been dismissed as inadequate just hours earlier. Washington Control confirms. Device neutralization, Foster announced, her voice carrying relief that was shared by everyone in the federal building's basement. All electronic signatures indicate complete shutdown of nuclear threat. Crisis status is officially terminated. The transformation that occurred during the helicopter flight back to Quantico was immediate and comprehensive. Specialists who had spent the morning mocking Maggie's equipment and questioning her qualifications now approached her with the reverence usually reserved for Medal of Honor recipients or commanders whose tactical brilliance had saved entire Cities from Destruction. Dr. Morrison found himself reassessing fundamental assumptions about the COF relationship between technological advancement and operational effectiveness that had guided his professional development for 3 decades. Maggie's success with analog methods against a threat that had defeated contemporary systems suggested that specialization in advanced technology might create vulnerabilities that traditional approaches could exploit. Walsh requested permission to examine Maggie's toolkit more closely, seeking to understand how equipment he had dismissed as obsolete could provide capabilities that millions of dollars worth of advanced systems had been unable to duplicate. What he discovered challenged every belief he held about the superiority of contemporary EOD technology. These tools have been specifically modified for nuclear work, Walsh realized, studying the wire cutters that had seemed crude, but which revealed sophisticated engineering, designed for working with nuclear device components. The modifications include features that electronic systems can't provide, capabilities that exist specifically because they operate outside technological parameters. Chun approached Maggie with the expression of someone seeking forgiveness for professional behavior that now seemed not just inappropriate, but dangerously ignorant. Her comments about Maggie's suitability for elite training had revealed assumptions about capability and qualification that could have prevented the successful neutralization of a nuclear threat. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology that goes beyond personal embarrassment," Chun said formally. "My assessment of your qualifications was completely wrong, and my behavior could have interfered with operations that saved hundreds of thousands of lives. I failed to recognize expertise that exceeded anything I've encountered in my career." Maggie's response demonstrated the kind of professional grace that distinguished truly exceptional individuals from merely competent ones. Instead of accepting apologies that highlighted others' failures, she used the opportunity to provide educational insights that could prevent similar misjudgments in future crisis situations. "Specialist Chun, your assessment was based on available information and reasonable assumptions about contemporary training requirements," Maggie replied. "Most people using equipment like mine wouldn't be capable of nuclear work at this level. Your skepticism was entirely justified based on normal circumstances." Kim found himself studying Maggie's notebook, which contained handwritten procedures and calculation methods that represented decades of nuclear emergency experience distilled into practical techniques that could be applied under the most extreme conditions. The knowledge documented in her composition book exceeded what most nuclear engineering programs provided in 4 years of academic study. These procedures incorporate lessons learned from nuclear emergencies that aren't part of contemporary training doctrine, Kim realized. This represents institutional knowledge that exists nowhere else within current federal capabilities. Thompson approached Maggie with the expression of someone whose expertise in identifying weaknesses and exploiting competitive advantages had been completely humbled by encounter with capabilities that transcended conventional evaluation methods. His assessment abilities had failed spectacularly when confronted with excellence that operated outside normal parameters. The briefing that followed at the Quantico facility provided details about Maggie's background that explained the morning's confusion while revealing the scope of nuclear expertise that contemporary EOD training had lost access to through overspecialization in technological approaches. Colonel Patricia Hawkins arrived via military transport to personally conduct the operational review, bringing with her documentation that filled gaps in understanding about Maggie's qualifications and the specialized programs that had developed capabilities which no longer existed within current federal resources. Margaret Sullivan directed nuclear emergency response operations that prevented multiple catastrophic incidents during conflicts that remain classified. Colonel Hawkins explained to the assembled specialists, her techniques were developed for nuclear threats that exceeded technological solutions, requiring manual approaches under combat conditions where electronic systems had been compromised or were unavailable. The revelation that Maggie's methods represented specialized capabilities rather than outdated techniques transformed everyone's understanding of the relationship between technological advancement and operational requirements. Her analog approaches weren't primitive. They were advanced techniques that had been developed for scenarios that contemporary doctrine didn't address. The nuclear device neutralized today incorporated countermeasures specifically designed to defeat federal technological capabilities, Hawkins continued. Intelligence analysis suggests foreign development of threats that exploit American dependence on electronic systems by creating scenarios where traditional methods provide the only viable neutralization options. Morrison found himself confronting implications about federal preparedness that extended far beyond explosive ordnance disposal training. If foreign intelligence services were developing threats that specifically exploited technological dependencies, federal capabilities might be fundamentally vulnerable to scenarios that required expertise that contemporary training programs had abandoned. Colonel Hawkins, are you suggesting that federal agencies need to maintain capabilities that operate independently of electronic systems? Morrison asked, beginning to understand strategic implications that went beyond individual training programs. Dr. Morrison, I'm suggesting that over-specialization in contemporary technology may have created vulnerabilities that hostile intelligence services can exploit. Hawkins replied, Ms. Sullivan's success today demonstrates that analog methods retain advantages that advanced systems can't provide under specific threat conditions. The implications of this assessment began to transform federal training doctrine within weeks of the Richmond incident. Agencies throughout the government initiated reviews of technological dependencies that might create vulnerabilities against opponents who possess detailed knowledge of American capabilities and specific intent to exploit electronic systems that modern operations relied upon for survival. Walsh found himself assigned to develop new training programs that integrated traditional techniques with contemporary technology, creating hybrid approaches that could operate effectively when advanced systems were compromised or unavailable. His experience watching Maggie's analog methods succeed, where technology failed, provided foundation for capabilities that didn't exist within current federal resources. Chun was selected for specialized training with nuclear emergency response teams, where her technical expertise could be combined with traditional methods that provided backup capabilities when contemporary systems proved inadequate. Her professional development would incorporate lessons learned from specialists whose experience encompassed scenarios that modern training doctrine didn't address. Kim received assignment to intelligence analysis programs that studied foreign threats specifically designed to exploit American technological capabilities, developing countermeasures against opponents who possess detailed knowledge of federal systems and specific strategies for defeating contemporary defensive approaches. Thompson was tasked with identifying other specialists whose experience might include capabilities that contemporary training had abandoned, seeking to preserve institutional knowledge before retirement eliminated access to expertise that current crises might require. The Federal EOD Training Center underwent comprehensive review of curriculum and methodology, incorporating traditional techniques that could provide alternatives when technological approaches proved inadequate against sophisticated threats. Maggie's success became a case study that fundamentally changed how specialists understood the relationship between advancement and capability. 6 months after the Richmond incident, Margaret Sullivan received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in a ceremony that honored her contributions to national security, while acknowledging that some forms of expertise transcended technological classification systems. Her analog methods had not only neutralized a nuclear threat, they had revealed vulnerabilities in federal preparedness that required fundamental changes in training and operational doctrine. The speech she delivered at the ceremony provided insights that transformed how government agencies approach the balance between technological advancement and operational resilience. Her words carried the weight of experience that had been gained under conditions that tested human capability beyond normal parameters. Excellence isn't about having the most advanced equipment, Maggie told the assembled audience of federal officials and military leaders. It's about understanding problems deeply enough to solve them regardless of available resources. Technology provides tremendous advantages, but it shouldn't become a dependency that creates vulnerabilities against opponents who understand our systems better than we do. Her toolkit was eventually displayed in the Smithsonian's National Security exhibit, accompanied by documentation that explained how analog methods had succeeded where America's most sophisticated technology had failed. The exhibit became required viewing for federal specialists, serving as a permanent reminder that true capability often transcended technological classification, and that assumptions about advancement could blind professionals to excellence that operated outside conventional parameters. The legacy of the Richmond incident extended far beyond explosive ordnance disposal, influencing federal training programs throughout the government and creating recognition that technological superiority required balance with traditional capabilities that could function independently of electronic systems. Maggie's 3-minute neutralization of a nuclear device had revealed truths about preparedness and capability that changed how America approached national security in an era when opponents possessed detailed knowledge of technological dependencies. Years later, specialists throughout the federal government understood that the most dangerous assumptions were those that dismissed capability based on appearance, that the most sophisticated threats often required the simplest solutions, and that excellence could emerge from unexpected sources when crisis demanded performance beyond conventional expectations. Margaret Sullivan had reminded an entire generation of federal specialists that true expertise often came disguised as obsolescence, that the most valuable capabilities might be those that contemporary wisdom considered outdated, and that salvation sometimes arrived carrying equipment that belonged in a museum but contained knowledge that no computer could duplicate. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.